Welcome to No Apologies. I'm Dana Lash. Now, I don't know about you, but when I'm looking for wisdom on how to live my life, how to raise my kids, keep my marriage together, how to be happy, there's one place that I know I can go for answers, insight, and wisdom, and that's Hollywood. That's right, Hollywood, and more specifically, Hollywood celebrities. I mean, who wouldn't want the expert knowledge base from people who are either really lucky or just really good at playing pretend for a living? Many have blown through 5 or 10 marriages. They berate people on sets, suffer from drug and sex addictions, and never seem happy. These are the perfect people to go to for advice, right? Not only are these experts really rich from playing pretend so well, but this virtue, it's a virtue, means that they get to tell you how to live. And I know it seems unfair, but it's not. See, when you get an Oscar, it also comes with a newfound right to lecture other human beings. And when celebrities are so adored by the world that they start to believe that they're actually more important and knowledgeable than everyone else, I mean, then you can kind of see it in, well, instances like this with Sean Penn. He has very strong opinions, particularly about you, who is not him, getting vaccinated. Watch.
My deep belief personally is that that no different than having everybody being able to drive 100 miles an hour in a car, that this is one of those things that should be mandatory, that we all get. There's different kinds of hesitancies, right? And so I don't think that there's much excuse to not know the information available anymore. And hence that's part of why I think it should be mandatory at this stage. I think that a resistance is just based on a certain kind of siloed lack of imagination and understanding of anything that's helpful to the human race. So I've become very frustrated by that, but I can only, work within my own bounds and say that for me, that it should be mandatory.
Do you get that? Sean Penn is angry at you for not taking advantage of the information from the CDC that isn't actually out there. How dare you? And he also thinks, quote, you have a lack of imagination and understanding of anything that's helpful to the human race, end quote. Now, if that came from Jeff Spicoli, his famous stoner Malibu surfer dude from Fast Times at Ridgemont High, that might be like funny or harmless, but it's coming from Sean Penn. So vaccines are like licenses, which are also racist when needed to vote. Right, it's racist to have an ID to vote, but not to get a vaccine. You have to show proficiency with a vehicle. I don't know if he knows this. Does he have a license? Has he seen a car? You have to show proficiency with it to get a license. Maybe a greater proficiency than the CDC director says that the vaccines have shown at stopping transmission of the virus. Plus, you're also allowed to drive a car on your own private property without a license. And also not everyone drives. And also driving isn't a right. And this is a favorite comparison of people who are anti-Second Amendment. It's a privilege. Those are two different things. How you transport yourself is entirely up to your own free will. But most importantly, though, a vehicle is not part of your person. So this is super important. This analogy requires recognizing your body as nothing more than a vehicle that the government can regulate, and it denies you your physical agency. Amazing how quickly the whole my body, my choice thing flies out the window when talking about whether or not the government has the power to mandate injections. Now, Sean Penn has what we call an opinion. Like all human beings, it is no more special or legitimate than anyone else's, especially on this topic. I mean, my goodness, the most honest thing that we can say is that nothing is certain with this pandemic. I don't think you can get any more honest than that. Even here in this clip with Wolf Blitzer, which I'm about to play, if you watch the whole interview, you can tell that the CDC, they don't really know all of the answers, or they don't know how to tell you that they don't want you to know all the answers, something like that. They said that the vaccine was the answer just a few weeks ago, and now they think it's only going to protect people from the original strain, maybe most people from the original strain, but not with all of the variants out there. Watch.
Our vaccines are working exceptionally well. They continue to work well for Delta with regard to severe illness and death. They prevent it. But what they can't do anymore is prevent transmission.
So this apparently is about the Delta and Lambda variant, maybe, perhaps. I mean, do we even know? I wish we knew what they knew. So see, all of this pompous certitude from supposed humanitarians like Sean Penn, saying that you are not helpful to the human race if you don't get vaxxed, like he says, it kind of shows the lack of wisdom to know what you know and know what you don't, right? We already know that the Lambda variant, and that Fauci and others have mentioned, it's reported to be even more maybe contagious than Delta. Maybe no one really has any data to back any of this up, but whatever. Maybe the lambda will turn out to be nothing. But this pandemic is zigzagging all over the place. And the CDC and the WHO, they have been a disaster on this. I mean, consider this. We have a respiratory virus that is surging in the middle of summer. RSV, right? Typically flu, colds, pneumonia, coronaviruses, they're dormant in the summer because high vitamin D production caused by sunlight exposure. That's one theory. But these viruses, they're not disappearing in the summer, and the effects are mitigated during this time. But yet the Delta variant seems to be surging, doing so even after half of the country is vaccinated, and many have natural immunity, which we're all supposed to pretend doesn't exist. So there are surprises and certainties with the coronavirus that they're not easy to come by. But that's not stopping another celebrity expert, Arnold Schwarzenegger, from telling you this. Watch.
But I think people should know there is a virus here. It kills people, and the only way we prevent it is to get vaccinated, to wear masks, to do social distancing, washing your hands all the time, and not just to think about, well, my freedom is being kind of disturbed here. No, screw your freedom, because with freedom comes obligations and kind of responsibilities. We cannot just say, I have the right to do X, Y, and Z. When you affect other people, that is when it gets serious. It's like no different than a traffic light. We put a traffic light at the intersection so someone doesn't kill someone else by accident. So this is why we have a traffic light. You cannot say, no one is going to tell me that I'm going to stop here, that I have to stop at this traffic light here. I'm going to go right through it. Yeah, then you kill someone else, and then it is your doing. So this is the same thing with the virus. You cannot go and not put a mask on, because when you breathe, you can infect someone else, and you can infect someone that then gets sick and may die.
History doesn't give Arnold high marks as governor of California or respecter of marriage vows, but he's an actor, so he has total certitude in himself, and you should too. Arnold is so sure of himself. He says, screw your freedom. And why Alexander Vindman shakes his head. Why is that guy still, why are they trying to make him a thing still? Come on. Arnold compares running a red light and endangering others to not getting vaccinated and wearing masks, which is silly, because running red lights will definitely endanger you, but most importantly, it will certainly endanger other people. But if someone has taken this vaccine, we're assured that that person is safe from any severity of symptoms. So his analogy kind of breaks down instantly. Using his metaphor, the vaccine should effectively turn your immune system into an impenetrable tank. So if somebody runs a red light, you're invincible, according to the CDC, because you had your vaccine and your immune system is well armored. Otherwise, why in the world do you need to get inoculated through the vaccine? It's enough to make you feel nuts. Secondly, masks. Okay, there's plenty of evidence. I mean, I've linked lists upon lists for people in my newsletter. Plenty of evidence that they do not at all work. We're talking about viral particles so little bitty tiny that a cloth mask, it's not magical. It's not going to stop them, okay? Maybe a fresh N95 changed repeatedly throughout the day would help, but not even that's 100%. But in the case of kids, we're talking about small people who repeatedly touch their faces throughout the day, and they move their masks around, they pull them down, they go look at a schoolyard, go look at a playground, go look at kids wearing masks, and you can see how they wear them. It's not going to work. Arnold Schwarzenegger's argument presupposes that someone is using also their freedom maliciously and recklessly. So are we actually seriously at the point where we think it's reckless to not wear a face covering that numerous studies have shown is entirely, and this is scientific, if you disagree with me, you hate science, ineffective at stopping the spread of the virus? Even Fauci himself noted this. Watch.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
You're sure of it? Because people are listening really closely to this.
Right now, people should not be walking. There's no reason to be walking around with a mask. When you're in the middle of an outbreak, wearing a mask might make people feel a little bit better, and it might even block a droplet, but it's not providing the perfect protection that people think that it is. And often, there are unintended consequences. People keep fiddling with the mask, and they keep touching their face.
And can you get some schmutz sort of staying inside there?
Of course.
How can people watch that clip, people like Arnold Schwarzenegger, and then say with total certitude that masks work? The data hasn't changed. I mean, all that changed was Fauci says wear one now. He never showed any actual data to support the 180. I mean, he just said that they told everybody this so that there wouldn't be a run on the supply for first responders and healthcare workers. This position, though, merely turns masks into the latest, as my friend Ace of Spades HQ once said, the political MacGuffin, right? It supposes two things. One, that masks are effective at stopping the transmission of the coronavirus, and two, that the virus doesn't have a 99% survivability rate, and that positive cases, every one of them, are all fatalities. That's not following the science. It's not even it's not logic at all, and it's horrible persuasion. All Fauci says when explaining his 180 on masks is, yes, I lied when I said they were ineffective. Watch.
Now, getting back to your first question, which was what about a month or so, or 2 or 3 ago, when people were saying, you don't really need to wear a mask? Well, the reason for that is that we were concerned, the public health community, and many people were saying this, were concerned that it was at a time when personal protective equipment, including the N95 masks and the surgical masks, were in very short supply. And we wanted to make sure that the people, namely the healthcare workers, who were brave enough to put themselves in harm's way to take care of people who you know were infected with the coronavirus and the danger of them getting infected, we did not want them to be without the equipment that they needed.
So he lied. How dare you not have faith in this man, horrible person? Not him, the liar who lied about herd immunity too. Now nobody could possibly trust Fauci. So how do we know that he's not, I don't know, lying about something else? Like the idea that small, tiny, little bitty baby children should be vaxxed. What else does he know that he's not sharing? And why all the strong arming? Is it because we have Hollywood celebrities that are not seeking, the leftist elite, not seeking to persuade anymore? Look at this from an AP story. It's actually pretty shocking and scary, the ideas that they're considering in order to force you to take a vaccine when we're questioning the efficacy of reducing transmissions with this vaccine and all of the other strains out there. The quote, still, while more severe measures, such as mandating vaccines for interstate travel or changing how the federal government reimburses treatment for those who are unvaccinated and become ill with COVID-19 have been discussed, the Biden administration worried that they would be too polarizing for the moment. So you have the Biden administration actually talking about mandated vaccinations just to cross the state line for the moment. So you're saying that you're considering not letting people drive down the road in their own car because they're not vaccinated? They're considering this? You're actually considering having a vax mandate to go across state lines, but not to go across the southern border. Okay, makes no sense. Naturally, the public's trust drops more and more while vaccine hesitancy shockingly increases. It reminds me of a verse in Romans that says, professing to be wise, they became fools. You know, the one thing that anyone needs to have when they pontificate about this virus is humility. And just know what you know and know what you don't. We're going to see that many predictions will not come true. And many so-called unassailable truths will be overturned. And that's already happened much throughout this pandemic. So a little bit of humility is in order, and some grace too. The truth is when you add it all up, the contradictions, the reversals, the censorship, the shaming and the blaming, what seems to really be at play here is a desire to force compliance to a certain belief system. Far left has always believed itself not only to be correct, but better than you and me, because they're more correct, right? And just because the left has institutional power doesn't mean that they can abandon persuasion. Their refusal to exert the effort to do so explains, their shaming and hatred for the unvaccinated and those that no longer want to wear masks. It's not about science or data or logic. It never was. And it's not about persuading either. It's about forcing you to see it their way. They don't even want to exert the effort to make an argument. And you better see it their way or they're going to make it impossible for you to live in society. And maybe we shouldn't be surprised. Celebrities like Sean Penn, he was besties with Hugo Chavez, right? He admired the Castro regime. People like him, who are the far left elite, they really believe that they're better than you and that you need to be controlled, really specifically by them, because you don't know what's good for you. And they actually believe that their platform is permission to partake in the controlling. It never occurs to them that maybe they should check out controlling their own lives first. What would make them think that they could control all of society and not drive it right into a ditch? Look, if Americans have lost trust in agencies of bureaucratic medical professionals, what makes celebrities think that they'll listen to them? Look, we all acknowledge that we were dealing with something unprecedented with this virus, and we extended a lot of grace in the beginning of this whole thing as a result. But sadly, this courtesy is not reciprocated for the people desperately still searching for, yes, actual answers about existing health conditions, boosters, natural immunities. We were barred from discussing lab leak, for instance, until Biden did. The biggest purveyor of misinformation isn't the speculation of people trying to answer unanswered questions. It's people like Fauci who burn the public's goodwill for a noble lie. Don't see much condemnation for that from Schwarzenegger or from Sean Penn. You know, we followed their science for a year and a half. Now how about following the science? And that goes for you too, Hollywood. So coming up, this story is insane. We've had a lot of discussions about women's protections, particularly when it comes to speech, using pronouns. And now you have to also consider women in prison. Transfers of men to women's prisons in California. This is one of the craziest stories I think I've read in a very long time, and it's proving to be incredibly dangerous for female inmates and female corrections officers. Wait until you hear the details and some common ground. Mary Kate Fain of the Women's Liberation Front joins me next to discuss. So California passed Senate Bill 132, which allows incarcerated, transgender, non-binary, and intersex men to be transferred into women's prisons. You know, we've been having this ongoing national discussion about protections of women with the transgender advocacy. And I think one of the big places that I guess maybe many in the nation forgot to look at was our prisons. And then we hear about the Senate bill, which has been signed into law. Well, now the system, they're facing pregnancies and increased violence in these facilities. Women are uncomfortable. They're terrified. They're being housed with males. And also corrections officers, female corrections officers, are also unable to really feel confident and comfortable doing their job. And now there are others that are trying to get Governor Gavin Newsom to halt transfers to protect these female inmates. And one of the groups leading the charge for this is WOLF, W-O-L-F, and that stands for Women's Liberation Front. Mary Kate Fain is the Director of Communications for Women's Liberation Front, and she joins me to discuss what she's been hearing on this and to give people insight. I love the common ground that we can have with others, especially when it concerns protections for women. Mary Kate, thanks so much for taking the time and joining us today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
We, as you know, because you've been writing a lot about this, and Women's Liberation Front has been talking a lot about this as well, protections for women, whether it's speech and in sports, but in prisons, until I saw that this bill, and I regretfully was not aware of this, of course, until being in Texas, until Newsom signed it into law. And then it was, I think it was a local news station in Los Angeles that did a story on this and had talked to one of your legal counselors on this issue. And I was really shocked about the number of males that are being transferred into women's prisons. But the other thing is that all they have to do, from what I'm looking at, they're transferred over if they identify as a woman. But is there anything to actually measure or prove that identity? I mean, just to be generous with the thought for a moment, what is the protocol with that, and how in the world is this happening?
So no, there's essentially no safeguards in this bill. They not only don't have to do anything to prove their identity as a woman, but they actually don't even have to identify as a woman. For example, they could identify as non-binary or any other variety of gender. There is one new policy that recently was put in place after it was clear how many men were going to be taking advantage of this to request transfers, that forces them to go through a little bit of a curriculum. That's a short couple hour, essentially like homework program where they have to write about their feelings and how scared they are to be housed with women. So the only safeguard that they have is really actually quite a joke.
I'm just absolutely shocked at that, because some of these prisoners, from what I understand, while they're maybe serving time for something else, they have a record that includes, sexual assault, rape. I think there was one that I think it was actually Women Liberation Front legal counselor had said that it was for repeated violent rape. Someone had a record, had a prior conviction of that. That's and are women prisoners, are they allowed to refuse to share housing with these men? Are they given any choice in that matter?
It's complicated, but in reality, no. they have to go through a whole lengthy process in order to deny being housed with someone, while meanwhile the male prisoners being sent in are actually able to request where they want to be housed. For a woman to deny a roommate, she has to declare them as an enemy, and it's a whole process that we've actually seen has resulted in retaliation when women do try to get the men out of their rooms.
Oh my goodness. Now I know you all at Women's Liberation Front have been talking to the women who are in the women's prison. What have you been hearing from these female inmates? I can only imagine how terrified some of them must be.
Yeah, so us and our partner organization, Woman to Woman, have spoken to hundreds of inmates in California's facilities. They're describing it as a nightmare's worst nightmare, being housed with these men. Over 80% of incarcerated women have experienced a history of physical, sexual, or domestic violence and abuse. And these women are now being re-traumatized by being forced to live with these men. And we're hearing, stories of symptoms of PTSD coming back. We're hearing stories of women being assaulted. And now we're actually hearing, in the most severe case, a story that a woman has actually become pregnant within the prison system after being forced to be housed with one of these men. And so the conditions here are just completely inhumane. It's cruel and unusual punishment by nearly any measure of that standard. And it's something that international law actually even prohibits as a war crime if this were to be done to prisoners of war. And this is what we're doing to California's incarcerated women in what's considered a democratic society.
Yeah, and we're talking with Mary Kate Fine with Women's Liberation Front. She's their communications director, and she also operates a website and does a number of things too. One of the other stories, one of the other reports coming out is that the prison began handing women condoms and then information as to what their options were if they were to become pregnant. That sounds to me like they're suggesting that there might be some a crime that's going to be occurring in the jail where these male inmates would be preying upon the female inmates.
Yes, exactly. In the California prison system, actually all sexual activity is considered non-consensual by default. And so by handing condoms to the female inmates, what they're essentially doing is admitting that they know that they're going to be raped and that, oh, well, here, at least you have a condom, as if that was ever any sort of, it's a Band-Aid on a bullet wound when you're dealing with sexual assault.
Wow. And the female corrections officers as well. I know some of those. I know your group has spoken to some of those. I can't imagine how, if I were a female, a corrections officer in this prison, because apparently it doesn't mean that they're excused from performing strip searches on some of these incoming inmates. And if it's a man who says that he's a woman, a female corrections officer would still have to take on that strip search. That cannot be comfortable.
That's exactly right. And what we're actually hearing is that the men are taking advantage of that moment, as can be expected, to sexually harass the COs. Oh. And these are, when you're dealing with men versus women, there are physical differences, and even the power dynamics within prison of COs versus the inmates does not change that power and physical dynamic that you're dealing with. And the COs are being put at risk. We hear that they're deeply unhappy with how this is being played out. But unfortunately, the individual COs, and honestly, even individual prisons, have their hands tied because of this law that was passed, SB 132, which was authored by Senator Scott Wiener of California, which essentially forces the prisons to do just this. And we know that the prisons do care about the safety of the women in their care, but there's only so much they can do under this policy. Their hands are essentially tied.
And that's awful because they know there's nothing that they could do. I can imagine if these female corrections officers were to speak out, even to advocate for the women that are under their care while incarcerated, they would get fired, wouldn't they?
Yes, and I believe that we've heard that their union is telling them not to speak to us.
Oh my, that's, oh goodness. So then you have to question, well, who are these people actually there to take care of? It does seem that you're prioritizing the incoming male inmates over these female inmates. And we'll talk about the women's spaces in a moment. How many men, Mary Kate, have been transferred over to the women's prison so far since this bill passed?
So we know that there have been about 300 requests for transfer, but most of those are still pending, actually. And the numbers are a little bit hard to get an exact count on because we believe that the prison system is not accurately reporting the sex of everyone who is being transferred. What we know is at a minimum, there are 14 men who have been reported to be transferred into CCWF And we believe that there are actually over 20, and at the peak, there may have been 28 men. And it does seem that in response to some of the news that's been coming out, including the potential pregnancy, that some of these men may have been moved into isolation in order to separate them from the general population and to further obscure the numbers.
Oh my goodness, and not even being able to rely on those institutions, to be honest about it. I like one of the points that had been made that not all transgender prisoners look like Laverne Cox from Orange is the New Black. As some of them even, not taking hormone treatments, they have full-on beards. And these are, men who went through puberty as males, and bone density, muscle mass. There's a significant advantage physically that they have over women when it comes to power and in those close quarters.
Yes, absolutely. We've even heard one man reported to one of the women that we spoke to. He was bragging that he went off his hormones the minute he got sent to the women's prison. And these are fully intact men, and the prison knows this, or else they wouldn't be handing condoms to the women and telling them what to do in case they got pregnant, because this is what happens when you have men who are, for all intents and purposes, just men who have a different identity about themselves. There really is nothing special or unique about these men compared to other men.
Right, that's a great point. We're talking with Mary Kate Fine with the Women's Liberation Front, and I have to say, I really appreciate your all's willingness to find that common ground with people. And I wanted to share this quote with everybody because you had this up on your website. You're always asked enough to where you had to put it up in a frequently asked question. Why do you work with conservatives? And you say the short answer is that women's very right to define ourselves as a meaningful sex class is on the line. And the shorter answer is that conservative women are also women. Conservative women have as much interest as any of us in our fundamental legal status and the protection of children. Feminist advocacy is for their benefit also, and that's on the Women's Liberation Front website. And I've been seeing that common ground also where it concerns, Mary Kate, women's sports. And my heart was broken when I was reading about a male weightlifter from New Zealand actually displacing a female weightlifter and a minority female weightlifter as well, and going to Tokyo in her place. We're seeing this not just in that, obviously that's on an international scale, but this is happening more and more just in our local schools. And I have to say, my background, being raised by a single parent, and I had a single mom, and sports was my escape. And I can't imagine what sports is going to look like when we essentially allow these policies to run women out of athletics. Talk to us a little bit about Women's Liberation Front, their views on that, and what kind of uphill fight this seems to have developed into.
Yes, women's sports are being absolutely demolished right now on a federal level. It's happening state by state first, but what we actually fear happening is that the Equality Act would be passed. And while the Equality Act promises really good things for women and for minorities that we think are important, it also comes with it the poisoning of this entire bill by removing the entire class of women as a meaningful category by enshrining gender identity into law. And so what we know will happen if the Equality Act is passed is that it won't be state by state anymore. Every single state will have no more women's sports. Men will be allowed to play in every single women's sports that's federally funded or supported in the country. Every women's prison in the country. And it's not just sports or prisons, it's also things like domestic violence shelters. We see this happening already in other countries, like in Canada, where men are being admitted into domestic violence shelters, and if women have a problem with that, they're the ones who are kicked out. This is a men's rights movement at its core, and this is why, like you mentioned earlier, I think it's so important that women across the political spectrum come together to fight this existential threat to women in American society right now.
And I think what you said, it is an existential threat. There is no exaggeration of this at all. I loved the quote that was given by 14-year-old Jolene Grover when she was speaking out. She said, prioritizing boys' wants over girls' needs, which I thought was such a brilliant way to put this. One last thing for you, because I know we're running out of time, and you've also spoken out, Women's Liberation Front spoken out on the First Amendment. And of course, the number of women that are now either getting suspended, either from social media platforms or fired from their jobs for not having this, and the best way to describe it is a patriarchal assault on their free speech. And to not submit to that, they're actually losing their ability to generate income. And this is another area where women here, and especially in the United States, where everyone's equal before the law in a republic, women are really being demoted into second-class citizenry as a result of these laws. Last word from you on this, Mary Kate.
Absolutely. It's really devastating, the impact that this has had on women's free speech. I was fired from a previous job for speaking out on this issue, and I've spoken to many other women who face the same sort of harassment and inability to make a living in this society that impacts their family and their children. This is the biggest fight today in feminism. And I think that liberal women need to get on board and wake up and join this fight along with us.
I agree with you, yeah, because the way, if this keeps going this way without a united fight against it, it's not going to be liberal or conservative women. We're just going to cease to exist. They're going to erase us just like they do erasing us using pronouns and using even the word pregnant women. That came out from the CDC this week. We can't even say that. Unbelievable. Mary Kate Fine, it's so good to talk with you. Would love to keep up as you all continue your advocacy with these issues with the Women's Liberation Front. Thanks so much for your time today. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. All right, folks, coming up, Florida. Everybody's been talking about Florida, and there are a lot of discussions about whether or not kids should be vaccinated, wear masks. Well, there's some legislation that is being proposed that aims to protect children from becoming targets of what's described as COVID-19 harassment. State Representative Anthony Sabatini joins me next to discuss this. Keep it here. Ian Pryor is the executive director of the group Fight for Schools, and he's also the senior counsel for Unsilenced Majority and a parent in that very county we were just talking about, Loudoun County, Virginia. He's pushing back hard on the Loudoun County School Board and leading the charge to save the kids. Ian, thanks so much for joining us. You've had quite a fight these past several months.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It really has been. I mean, the past 3 months, it seems like Loudoun County Public Schools is in the news at least, 5 times a week.
Yes, I mean, I thought here in Texas, we had a big old fight, and we just had municipal elections, and I thought what we all went through was pretty rough. Then I see these videos of parents being arrested at school board meetings for doing nothing more than just loudly expressing dissent, which is still allowed. Is that the most heated that it's become? Or is there stuff that we've missed? Because that was pretty insane.
That was definitely the most heated it's become. I mean, really, it was a culmination, I think, of a year and a half worth of frustration from parents. It started out with the open schools movement. The school board wasn't listening to parents. They were mocking parents on social media and emails. And then when you get to mid-March, that's when you had these 6 school board members that were part of this private Facebook group where one of the school board members essentially lit a fire, and you had all these people in there listing dozens of parents that spoke up at school board meetings, and they wanted to infiltrate their groups, publicly expose them, even hack their websites. So really, it was about probably 8 of us that got together on someone's back deck in March and said, listen, we've got to recall these school board members. They have been an abject failure for their time in office, and it's really started to grow because every time we think that, okay, this is going to be a long road to get these signatures to recall them. They go and they step in it again, whether it's putting a teacher on administrative leave for exercising his First Amendment rights, or this Tuesday you saw there were 250 speakers lined up to speak. They didn't like what the people had to say, so after 50 or so, they cut off public comment, and then the superintendent declared, that this is an unlawful assembly, even though there was no threats of violence, nothing, and that's what you saw on Tuesday night. But that was by far the biggest crowd we've ever seen there.
And you mentioned that Facebook group. Talking to Ian Pryor, has been leading that fight there in Loudoun County, Virginia. This was insane to me. This 624-member private group on Facebook, where they were essentially, these are school board members. They were gossiping about you all. And this also was really shocking to me. It said that the Sheriff's Criminal Investigations Division was reviewing the matter, but the group's activities were no surprise to top law enforcement because the county's prosecutor appears to also be a member of the Facebook group. And I have to say, Ian, my favorite thing about that aspect of the story was a local mother named Jen Durham, which I think she was the one who was really kind of trying to really light that fire, said, quote, anyone know any hackers, end quote, which is perhaps maybe the most may I speak to the manager thing I've ever heard in my life. And you were on that list. They named you. You had a neighbor who named you.
Yeah, that's right. So I was on the list. I was actually listed twice, once for writing an article in the Federalist, and the second time, amazingly, was for going to a school board meeting and speaking up for First Amendment rights of teachers and students back in, I think, October of 2020. And, a lot of the people that were on that list, it's kind of branded as they were speaking out against critical race theory, but the vast majority of people on that list had gone to school board meetings trying to get schools reopened. And then just this past week, we revealed on Monday something that we hadn't known before, that there was a second private Facebook group back in 2020 that had 7 school board members, and they were basically discussing school opening and closing policy to the exclusion of 99% of the community. So what you have here is a school board that doesn't respect the rule of law, doesn't respect Virginia open meetings law, doesn't respect the First Amendment of the Constitution, and ignores their own code of conduct.
Yeah, that's what happened in where I am in Carroll ISD in South Lake, Texas. They had the school board members that were violating Texas's Open Meetings Act and talking about implementing the CRT curriculum and this plan going forward in school without any knowledge from parents. It took a lot of FOIA requests to get that. I love that you said that you all met on somebody's back deck. That's probably the most American thing ever. I mean, it just kind of gets to the heart of this issue. You said too that really all of this began in October of 2020, and I was thinking about this when I was looking back to see when I could first see some of the objections to a lot of the curriculum and when it really was hitting a high note, that when CRT being implemented in schools across the country. Do you think that this was caught, or at least enough parents paid attention to this because of the lockdown? I mean, and that maybe if we hadn't had a lockdown, I hate even saying this, would this have been caught to the extent that it was?
Yeah, absolutely not. I think this was 100% due to the pandemic. I mean, you have children that are in front of their Chromebooks, parents working at home, and really the curtain was peeled back on what was going on in schools. And now I've said this many times, when you want to look at somebody who to blame to let this happen, we got to take a look in the mirror, because over the past 10 years, 20 years, whatever it is, we've ignored local elections. We've assumed that we send our kids those 2 doors at school, that everything's going to be safe and they're going to learn what they're supposed to be learning, math, science, etc. But in reality, that's not what they're focusing on. While kids are suffering massive learning loss, they're falling behind in math and science. You have these school boards and these school administrations focused on changing names of mascots and how to train a young generation of activists, when that is not what schooling is about. It's about preparing the future generations to succeed in the world, going forward.
Yeah, we heard some of the excerpts, the parents reading some of the material. That did not sound like, it sounded like YouTube comments. It did not sound like any kind of literary material that was going to provide any kind of education at all whatsoever. This, and we're talking to Ian Pryor, who's been fighting this in Loudoun County, Virginia. There are a lot of, I wanted to get your reaction to a lot of these critical race theory proponents out there who say, no, you people are incorrect. This is not critical race theory. This is education, and how this narrative now is manufactured with all these different governors signing legislation banning the institutionalized Marxist racism being implemented in schools. They're saying, no. Now they're saying that you can't even teach about slavery or anything that's happened in America's past. I'm not aware of anything like that being specified or spelled out in any legislation. Are you?
No, absolutely not. And I find that response and those talking points ludicrous, that somehow we don't want history being taught in an accurate way. No, of course not. But when you're talking about second graders, kindergartners, third graders, there's a time and a place for how you explain the context of how things develop. And the time and the place is not second, third, fourth grade. So I would tell all those people that say, yeah, we should absolutely teach, kindergartners right off the bat that, the founding fathers were racist. Well, why don't you also tell them that there's no such thing as Santa Claus and there's no such thing as the Easter Bunny? Because obviously there are things that are age appropriate to get into. And when you get into high school and you get into college, as long as you teach different perspectives and you don't force one perspective down kids' throats, that's fine. Allow people to think critically. That's how they develop, and that's how they learn the causes and effects of various things that happen throughout history. But what they want to do is present one side that is really this half-baked theory that has not been tested, and they want to test it in our schools, and that is what we're seeing all throughout the country.
Yeah, Ian, one last question for you on this. You were mentioning earlier how kids have been suffering from having schools locked down, although it allowed parents to get some really good insight into what was being done to kids. I mean, I look at some of this stuff and it seems emotionally abusive, very abusive to kids. Have you all spoken about what kind of impact this education has had, or this CRT has had on your kids? Have students in the area have spoken out about what impact having that directed at them, the privilege, et cetera, what effect that's had on their lives and morale?
Yeah, certainly there have been a lot of students that have talked about this at school board meetings, but what you really see is when they come home and talk to their parents. Somebody that lives across the street from me, her second grade daughter came home and she's like, Mommy, today I learned that women and minorities never get credit for anything they do. Those are the kind of things that you're seeing where these little kids come home and they don't necessarily understand what they're being taught. I have a second grader. I read her a book about, Columbus coming to the New World. The next day she comes back to me and she says, Daddy, why did you read me a book about a bad guy? We learned today that he was a murderer and he had a lot of slaves. Now, of course, you can talk about those kind of things when you're in high school, but I went back and looked at the video. I mean, it was a cartoon with piles of dead bodies in it. That is absolutely inappropriate for second graders to be learning.
Yeah, it completely inappropriate. And these are, and for educational systems that want to pride themselves on historical accuracy and fact, they want to incorporate the 1619 project, where even some communists were objecting to that because they said it made them, the historical inaccuracy made them look bad. It's just insane to me. Ian Pryor, appreciate what you do and all of the parents around the country that you're helping by, giving them a blueprint so that they know how to fight this in their community. I mean, we're just hearing this all over the nation, and things are changing. So we appreciate your time, Ian Pryor. Thank you. Well, it seems everybody is coming out as something. It's all the rage nowadays. These days, there's more gender identities than flavors at Baskin-Robbins. So what's yours? Well, it turns out another Robin, the Robin from Batman and Robin, is coming out too as bi. Now, some of you that are more observant won't be surprised. I mean, after all, Robin could never hold a candle to that piece of hot, toxic masculinity called Batman. I mean, imagine always playing second fiddle to that crime-fighting, square-jawed stud. Batman has a utility belt that would make any crime fighter have a serious locker room envy, right? So what do you do when you're Robin and you're always playing backup to that big, toxic, masculine Batman? Well, one thing you could do is try to overcompensate by running around with hot babes like Robin often did in the past. Of course, those lady friends always seemed like just friends, really more so than anything else. Well, if the bright colors and girlfriends didn't get your attention, Robin must have thought, I'll come out as bisexual. Everyone's doing it after all. And that's what happened in the latest installment from DC Comics. Robin is apparently now into dudes. In the book, he agrees to go on a date with a dude named Bernard Dowd after having a light bulb moment as they fought villains together. Robin rescues Bernard, follows him by paying Bernard a visit at his apartment, and then Bernard says, Tim Drake, do you want to go on a date with me? And the episode ends with a cliffhanger as Drake responds, or he answers Bernard's request with, yeah, I think I want that. Fans of the comic welcome the revelation, saying that they totally suspected that Drake may be bisexual for years. So apparently fans are loving Robin's new sexual identity. Is he going to dress up as a rainbow suited unicorn next? Who knows? And no word from Batman on Robin's newfound sexual preferences. So what's next? Will the Batcave, will it have non-gendered bathrooms in the future? Maybe. Like Bernard Dowd, Robin's new beau could be gender fluid. Wouldn't want to offend him. It's also confusing, and it's enough to make Batman want to spend more time with the Joker because he's starting to look a heck of a lot more sane these days. That does it for us tonight. Thanks for tuning in. Good night, and don't bend the knee.